Hey, welcome to The Conversation. My name is Kyle, and I'm coming to you from the First Colony Church of Christ in Sugar Land, Texas. I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad that we are together. Today, we are in a teaching series here on The Conversation called Psalms, the playlist for life. And today, we're going to be looking at Psalm 2. Last week, our first week, we did Psalm 1. Today is Psalm 2. But that does not necessarily mean that we're going to be doing one psalm each Sunday for the next 150 Sundays or for the next almost 3 years. There are 150 Psalms. We're not going to do each one. We're going to kind of cherry pick our way through them. But I thought it was kind of great for us to do Psalm 2 today because it is one of the most quoted Psalms in the New Testament. And there are some similarities. There are some connecting points between Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 that give us a high degree of confidence that whether or not these two Psalms were one Psalm early on in their compilation, it does mean that there was at least a steady influence of these two Psalms together, even in the early church. In fact, we have some of our earliest manuscripts that mention Psalm 2 as being the first Psalm, or at least part of the first Psalm in the book of Psalms. Now, most of them don't say that. One of them does, but it gives us some confidence to say that the early church used these two Psalms together. So for our first 2 weeks of this teaching series, we're going to let them hold hands and we're going to talk about them both. By the way, if you missed last week, go ahead and catch it on our site. It's good stuff. And today, you know what? I hope you go ahead and share this right now. Share it on your socials. Invite some people to be a part of the conversation with you. By the way, if you can, go ahead and log into the chat. Say hi. Let us know who you are. Let us know where you're from. And just get to know some folks who chat pretty regularly. Don't overlook or take that for granted. You don't have to chat at all during our time together, but it is a nice way to be connected to our hosts. Our hosts are there. They got some great information for you about the First Colony Church, and you can participate and ask questions. By the way, since I'm here and I'm kind of telling you this, I'm going to be leading an intensive it's April 19th. I didn't have this in my notes to say, so I had to think about the date. It's going to begin on April 19th. It's an intensive over our Bible study here at the First Colony Church called First Conversations. It's a very portable, foundational study that builds up on the life of Jesus. It's got 4 sections in it. We're going to be doing 4 sections in 3 consecutive Tuesdays during your lunch hour from 12 to 1. They're also going to be on Zoom. If you want to register for that, you can find it online. You can also just mention it to our hosts in our chat boxes, and they'll get you the information on how to do that. But it's going to be cool. I've led several of these intensives, and they're great. If you are a seasoned believer, it's going to do you some good. If you're just a seeker, if you've got some questions you want answered, you can register, and we'll help you do that. And we'll teach you how to share this Bible study with other people. So I know this was we're going on a path here that I didn't plan, but I want you to be invited to this and to just make sure that you are aware and that you can participate. It's going to be live on Zoom beginning April 19th on a Tuesday for 3 consecutive Tuesdays. So back to Psalm chapter 2. Glad you're here. Let's just jump right in. Let's read this, and then we're going to talk about it maybe in a little different way. I'm going to be reading Psalm 2 from the New International Version. It has 12 verses, so stay with me. You can follow along in your Bible if you want. Here we go. Psalm 2, chapter 1. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Actually, or his Messiah. That's what it means there. Verse 3, let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. Verse 4, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Verse 10, therefore, You kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Those are pretty strong words in Psalm 2, right? I mean, you get this sense when you read it that there are extremes, some extreme intensity from everyone who's speaking in this psalm. So we will get to that in just a moment. But we're gonna hang our hat for a minute, especially in verse 4, right? So this is the response of God to all of the nations, and it says that the nations are conspiring and the peoples are plotting. The kings of the earth are making their stand. The rulers gather together, and they have an explicit purpose in combining forces, and that is to overthrow or thwart the way of God. And it is a violent compilation, a violent collective of people. All of these rulers are gathering together with one specific purpose, and that is to overthrow not only God, but what the text calls his anointed one, his what we learn later, his son. Now, in Psalm 2, this psalm is completely anonymous. We don't know who wrote this, but Acts chapter 4 actually says that this psalm was written by David. So we're going to say that David wrote this psalm. All right. So David writes this psalm, and we have this extreme intensity that's happening all the way around. Again, the gathering of the leaders of the world against the anointed one, God and his anointed one. And the extreme reaction of God here is that he's laughing at this gathering of violence. And then it says that he rebukes them. All right, so we have something really intriguing here that I think is worth discussing, because if we don't really talk about reality here in the conversation, then what's the point, right? So it's very easy for us to rest in the poetic nature of this psalm, right? It's a playlist for life. That's what this is. It's a song, right? It's easy for us to see this psalm for its literalness. But the flip side of this is that we've got a lot of things happening in the world right now that would make us think, or anyone, that God is not rebuking anyone in his anger. We have wholesale invasions of countries. We have manipulation of currency, and even in developed nations, that is going to, if not already, can perhaps cause some economic hardship for citizens of various nations. There are, and seem to be, a complete cultural shift in how we view holy and ordained marriages and lifestyles that glorify God. We have things that appear to us to be out of control, and we await a response from God that he rebukes the evilness that's happening with his anger. We're waiting for that, because we see this. We see in real time the destruction of people against people. We see nations rising up and revolting and seemingly having their own way with citizens of their own countries and citizens of other countries. And it makes us wonder, right? Let's be real. Let's be honest for a minute. It makes us wonder exactly what God is up to. Will he not avenge the innocent? That's a real question. And it's a question that is easily provoked from this psalm. It's a question that makes us absolutely wonder, where is God? Is he laughing right now? Is he rebuking people in his anger? What will be his response? I don't know if you know this or not, but in the 1860s, the 1860s produced the world's first automatic weapon, first machine gun. It's called the Gatling gun. It was used sparingly in the Civil War. It was used in some labor disputes in the New England states in the 1870s, but it really became known. It was extremely prominent in the Spanish-American War in the late 1890s, 1898 or so. That's when it gained its prominence. In fact, it was well known to be part of the assault on San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. That's really when it became famous. So 1898 was when the Gatling gun became extremely famous and part of the cultural rhetoric. All right? In the 1940s, so 50 years later, less than 50 years later, America had developed and exploded its first atomic weapon, precursor to what we would call nuclear weapons now. So an automatic rifle, a machine gun, to a city-destroying bomb in less than 50 years. With all of our technological moxie in America, we were especially good at creating weapons to kill people. The 20th century brought us massive bloodshed. It was the most violent century in human history, with close to 100 million deaths by violence alone in global wars. We've seen the page turned in the 21st century with multiple wars and invasions. The best that we can do in the world and in humanity is seemingly to kill other people. That's what our technological accomplishments have allowed us. Now, of course, let's not be too political here. Great weapons and great weaponry are also used to keep people safe, to deter threats. We know that. But let's just talk on a purely Platonic level here, that our technological advancements have been rapidly and widely used in global bloodshed. The world does not seem to be in control. Historically speaking, the world does not seem to be in control. I don't know if you know this, but one of the very earliest historical records that we have of humanity, one of the very earliest, is a Sumerian bas relief. I don't know if you know what those are. They're like a bas relief is a piece of a wall. It's things that were it's a stone that was used to etch out historical events. The bas relief came to us from Babylon. It was produced around 3000 BC, so something like 5,000 years ago. And you know what it shows? It shows soldiers fighting each other. They're wearing helmets. They are carrying maces. They have shields. In other words, one of the earliest communal artifacts of humanity explicitly shows warfare, shows violence. So as we read Psalm 2, we have to ask ourselves this question. We're smart people, right? So if this is legit, if this is true, then what's happening here? Why have these things not stopped? Why are we still living in an experience of humanity that seems to promote violence and bloodshed with little accountability? That's really the question that you want to ask, right? When you read through the first 3 verses in this gathering, this collective of violence that happens, and you see the Lord's response in verse 4, this laughing and scoffing, and then this rebuke. We have to ask ourselves, is God here? Is he going to answer this? And the next honest question is, why hasn't he answered it yet? 5,000 plus years of violence does not automatically inspire confidence in God's response, at least how you and I would feel. Psalm 2 is one of the most quoted Psalms in the New Testament. I want to kind of give you a rundown of this. It meant a lot to the first century and the first generation of believers as they began to understand who Jesus was and who he was, not only to them, but who he was historically. In Psalm chapter 2 was quoted in several places. Let me just kind of give you a few of these. You find it in echoes of Jesus' baptism in Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. I've got these written down, so I want to make sure I get them all. In Mark chapter 1, verse 11, and Luke chapter 3, verse 22. If you ever get lost, you can just hit pause and rewind this. We have this idea of, this verse of God telling Jesus that he's his son. That's what you see at the baptism of Jesus. You've got also in Acts chapter 4, verses 25 through 28, the first century church, the first generation of believers applied Psalm chapter 2 as a way to explain how the Messiah was crucified. In other words, their paradigm was that the first three verses of this collective of violence, let's just use that phrase, we've said that a couple of times now, the way that they express their violence and try to impede the work of God was by crucifying the Messiah. So the early church, the first generation of believers in Acts chapter 4, verses 25 through 28, interpreted that action in light of Psalm chapter 2. Even Paul used Psalm chapter 2 when he applied it to the ministry of Jesus, when he talked about Jesus' sonship and his resurrection and his ascension. All of these things, according to Paul, confirmed God's promises that Jesus was the anointed one, was the Messiah. You can find that in Acts chapter 13, verses 32 and 33. You also see Psalm chapter 2 quoted in the first chapter of Hebrews, especially chapter 1, verses 3 and verses 5 and 6, in this comparison of Jesus against angels and against his authority over angelic beings. And even in Revelation, the writer of Revelation, the Apostle John, actually said that Jesus was born of a woman, but he was, and this was in Revelation chapter 12, verse 5, that he was destined to rule the nations with an iron scepter. We just read that. He's also the rider on the white horse in Revelation 9, who would strike down all of the nations in God's wrath. In other words, Psalm chapter 2 was a precious psalm. It was a way that the first generation of believers began to understand the unbelievable moment of Jesus in their life. How can you understand Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension without the template of Psalm 2? So this gives you an idea of how this was interpreted in the first century church. And you and I should interpret it the very same way. We should see Psalm 2 as finding its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. But that doesn't dismiss our earlier comments that as this experience of life has shown us that violence seems only to replicate and reproduce violence, that you and I are here on the other side of a global pandemic wondering, when is God going to respond to this life, to this experience of life, and to this experience of violence, and to this experience of conspiracies and difficulties and frustrations? That's really the question, right? I mean, on one hand, it's all good that the church understood this psalm in light of Jesus, but the real honest question for those of us who are searching and those of us who are wondering, and even for those who have been believers for a long time, is, does hope not run out after a while? That's really the question, right? Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 actually go together. Let me kind of string this together for you, then we'll make some comments here as we wrap up. Psalm chapter 1 actually begins with how blessed or how happy is the person. Psalm 2 ends with that same word, actually the same word in Hebrew. Psalm chapter 1 ends with a threat, and Psalm chapter 2 actually begins with a threat. Psalm 1, the godly person meditates on the law and the instruction of God. In Psalm chapter 2, the wicked, they meditate. It's actually translated as devising or plotting here in most English translations. In Psalm chapter 1, there is a contrast between the righteous person and the wicked person. But in Psalm 2, there is a contrast between the rebellion of the wicked rulers and nations and the rule of the anointed one, of God's anointed one. And here's something kind of cool, especially when you think about stanzas and songs and poetry. Psalm chapter 1 consists of 2 stanzas and 6 verses. This is probably more technical than you want, but I think it's kind of cool. Psalm chapter 2 is twice as long, consisting of 4 stanzas and 12 verses. And it's like a 3-act play. It's probably closer to 4, but for us, I think it's important to know that we've got 3 acts or 3 movements in this psalm. In the first 3 verses, you've got the question of violence and the question of rebellion in the world. In Act 2, or the second part, the second movement of this psalm, in verses 4 through 6, you've got this great picture of God sitting. He's not upset at the conspiring of all of these wicked people, this collection or this collective of violence. He's not upset about that. He's sitting. So it's this great picture of God's response to this collective of violence, the rebellion of the wicked. In Act 3, not Acts chapter 3, in Act 3, or the third movement, from verses 7 through 9, you've got the anointed one of God actually speaks into the situation and reveals what we now will understand, we'll talk about this in a minute, was God's plan to deal with this rebellion and this violence. And then in my brain is thinking Acts. In the fourth movement, in the fourth act of this psalm, in the last couple of verses 10 through 12, the psalmist, the narrator, speaks again and kind of concludes these statements. So we can kind of we can at least take the 2 and 3 can probably be grouped together right in the middle, these second and third movements. So really we have it's like a 3-act play happening here. Now, why does all this matter? Well, I think there are some very clear things we have to understand. The truthfulness of the first 3 verses says that there is an active rebellion that's happening in the world. Not only that, it seems to happen in accordance with the authority of God. God has authorized this rebellion. Now, that doesn't feel right to us, those of us who have certainly been raised and have lived in very affluent places, that we have a difficult time with suffering of any kind. So for us to hear that some of this can even be authorized, that's a little hurtful, but it's here. There is an active rebellion in the world against God and against the ways of God. This is the exact truthfulness. What's also obvious here is that this rebellion seems to go even beyond David's own life, because the anointed one of God, who we now understand to be Jesus, at the time of this writing, it really wouldn't have been considered a messianic psalm. It wasn't written with some prophetic ideals. It was a statement probably used in the coronation of the king of Israel. That's probably what the point of this was, but it was reinterpreted and reused in the New Testament to indicate how to understand Jesus. So we have here, even if it wasn't a messianic psalm, it says something about the rebellion that occurs not when the king was coronated, but even as the first century of believers saw it, as Jesus being the one who assumes this position of the Christ, the anointed one. So we have that by default happening here, but we also have what we see in the second and third movements of this psalm is the absolute sovereignty of God in the situation of human history. Again, I don't want to speak in superlatives. That doesn't necessarily do anything to salve the wounds of those of us who have lost people who are dear to us, or for those who are suffering greatly right now. It doesn't really help us to understand that. But it is critical to know that if we serve a God who is all-knowing, then nothing happens without his authorization. And Psalm 2 actually speaks into that. In fact, one of the greatest pictures of God is in verse 4. We've already mentioned it, but when this rebellion is occurring, God doesn't lash out. He doesn't react. He doesn't stand and scream and shout. In fact, the picture is that he said, listen to this, the one enthroned in heaven, the one who sits in heaven, he's laughing. He's laughing at the response, or at least the offense, of the wicked rulers on earth. This is who he is. It doesn't mean that he's finding joy in this petty threat. Doesn't mean that at all. It's more of he sees the ridiculousness of these empty threats. How can people on earth, rulers on earth, actually think that they can thwart the plan of God? That's his first response. There is this calm assurance in a world that seems to be completely out of control. But in this very same vein, from verses 7 through 9, we find out something extremely critical and valuable to us. That God had already made a plan to deal with the evil and the rebellion of humanity. This is a predetermined plan. This was not a surprise to God. Listen to this. I will proclaim, these are the words of the anointed one, right? These are the words of the one whom God anoints. I will proclaim the decree of I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. And he said to me, "You're my son, and today I've become your father. You ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possession, and you will rule them with an iron scepter, and you will dash them to pieces like pottery." This is not a small response from the anointed one of God. This was already built into the plan of the world. In other words, Jesus, he's not plan B, he's plan A. He's plan A. The rebellion and the collective of violence and evil does not surprise God, because he has already predetermined a way to deal with that evil, with that violence, with that wickedness. He already has found the solution. This is a massive theological statement here in chapter 2, verse 7. These are theological waters that in which we can swim for a great while. And we're not going to necessarily go down that road today, but it's enough for us to say that Jesus is the anointed one of God who has the power to break the stronghold of people who claim power over others, selfishly claim power. This is no small statement. But let's dip our toes a little bit in these theological waters for just a minute, because Hebrews makes an incredible statement about how Jesus is actually dealing with the evilness of the world. So in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 13, we find that the author of Hebrews says that Jesus is waiting for his enemies to be made his footstool. So the great theological point of that one statement is that his death and his resurrection has completely defeated evil. It is now null and void. Even though we still understand and feel its effects, there is an ultimate plan of God to eventually render this evil no more. But Hebrews 10 actually says something more incredible about Jesus' current role right now in this time of waiting. It actually says that until that day, he is the one that actually intercedes for us. He is the one that waits for us as we wait. In other words, Jesus is not, he's not outside of the human experience here, right? 1 John chapter 2 says he intercedes for us. Hebrews chapter 10 says that he waits with us. An almost an unimaginable theological point that the Savior of the world, the anointed one of God who was and received the punishment for our sins and was raised in glory from the dead, now, like you and I, enters into our current human experience and waits for that day when all evil will be over. He has provided the solution for that. And now, like you and I, he waits with us. The final part of this psalm wraps up our response to this condition in verses 10 through 12. Let me read this again. Therefore, kings, you need to be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The finale of this psalm calls for our repentance, for our submission to Jesus, for our submission to this way of God. In other words, you and I don't want to be part of the problem, as if there is a problem. We don't want to be the ones conspiring against God and trying to subvert the plans of God, even in our own life. If and when we do that, we take the identity of the kings and the rulers in Psalm 2. But what David says in Psalm 2 is that we must also submit to this plan of God. We might not necessarily like this plan. We want loose ends tied up now. We want vengeance on those who have hurt us. But David writes, our place is submission and repentance. It's submitting to this predetermined plan of God and partnering with Jesus in this time of patience and waiting. Psalm 2 is an incredible psalm. In fact, I wish we had a little bit more time. We could talk a little bit more in depth about this. But I want you to take heart as you read Psalm 2. This is not hypothetical. This is not an imagination of some future time. Evil has been dealt with. Its sentence has been given. And even though we still feel the consequences of those evil actions of other people, we feel the suffering of that. We understand that. I want us to be assured that through the grace and the mercy and the power of Jesus, the solution to that has been given. And you and I are invited to be a part of that. We wait for the end of this along with Jesus from Hebrews chapter 10. This is good stuff here. And I hope that you've been encouraged today. Don't forget, we're going to stay in Psalms for a little while. We'll be back next Sunday. I'm not going to tell you which Psalm. You'll just have to log on and see. But until that day, I want you to be blessed and have a great week. And I'll see you right back here again next Sunday. Have a great day.